For centuries, historians and geneticists argued over a question nobody could actually prove either way. After 2,000 years scattered across Persia, Iraq, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, did the Eastern Jewish communities of the world still carry a real, traceable genetic connection back to the ancient Levant? Or had they, after so many centuries living among Persian, Arab, and Central Asian populations, simply been absorbed into the local populations around them, keeping only the religion while the ancestry quietly dissolved? Scientists finally solved it, and the answer surprised even the researchers who ran the study. We're going to walk through exactly what that research found, community by community, and by the end, you'll understand exactly why this result mattered so much, not just for genetics, but for a 2,000-year historical debate that religious tradition, oral history, and written records alone could never fully settle. If genetics, deep history, and the real evidence-based story of human migration interest you, stay for this one and hit subscribe, because we dig into stories exactly like this every week. Let's start with why this question was so genuinely difficult to answer before modern DNA sequencing existed. Jewish communities in the Middle East, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, often grouped today under the broader term Mizrahi, meaning Eastern, to distinguish them from the Ashkenazi communities of Central and Eastern Europe and the Sephardic communities descended from Iberia. Trace their presence in these regions back to the Babylonian exile, roughly 2,600 years ago, and in some cases even earlier, long before the Roman destruction of the Second Temple scattered Jewish populations even more widely across the ancient world. That means communities like the Jews of Iraq, Iran, Georgia, Kurdistan, and Bukhara, in what's now Uzbekistan, had, by the modern era, been living continuously in their respective regions for somewhere between 1,500 and 2,600 years, an extraordinary span of time, long enough that almost every other historical population that experienced comparable isolation eventually shows significant genetic blending with its surrounding neighbors. Historians had real, legitimate reasons to expect the same might be true here. Religious conversion, intermarriage, and simple demographic pressure over dozens of generations should, in theory, have gradually diluted any distinct ancestral signal these communities originally carried, to the point where distinguishing an Iraqi Jewish population from the broader Iraqi population around them purely on genetic grounds might no longer even be possible. Each of these communities also has its own distinct, well-documented history worth understanding before we get to the genetics. The Jewish community of Iraq traces its presence in Mesopotamia directly back to the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously documented Jewish diaspora communities anywhere in the world, with a continuous presence through the Babylonian, Persian, Islamic, and Ottoman periods before the community's near-total immigration in the mid-20th century. The Jewish community of Iran has an equally ancient documented presence, closely tied to the Persian Empire's historical role in ending the Babylonian exile and permitting the return to Jerusalem, with communities persisting through millennia of subsequent Persian and Islamic rule. Georgian and Mountain Jewish communities in the Caucasus developed their own distinct histories and, in the case of Mountain Jews, their own distinct Judeo-Tat language, shaped by centuries of relative isolation in a mountainous region straddling the boundary between several regional empires. And the Bukharan Jewish community of Central Asia developed along the historic Silk Road trade routes, absorbing Persian linguistic influence into their own distinct Judeo-Tajik dialect, while maintaining communal and religious continuity across the centuries. At the same time, Jewish religious law and communal practice have historically placed a strong emphasis on maintaining a distinct religious and social community, including significant restrictions on intermarriage outside the faith across many historical periods and regions. That created a competing prediction. If those communal boundaries were maintained rigorously enough, for long enough, a population could plausibly remain genetically distinct from its neighbors even after over 2,000 years living in the same region, speaking the same regional language, and adopting much of the same regional culture around them. Both predictions were reasonable. Both had historical evidence pointing in their favor. And until scientists could actually sequence and compare genomes at scale, nobody had a way to settle which prediction, if either, was actually correct, which is exactly the kind of standoff ancient and modern DNA research has repeatedly proven uniquely capable of resolving, in case after case, across completely different regions of the world. It's also worth understanding why this specific question took so much longer to resolve than some other similar debates in population genetics. Sequencing enough individuals from enough geographically scattered, sometimes small and historically displaced communities, with appropriate community consent and collaboration, at a scale large enough to produce statistically meaningful results, required both the technology and the international research coordination to reach a certain level of maturity first. Smaller genetic studies of individual communities existed earlier and had produced hints in one direction or another, but a study broad enough to actually test the full range of Eastern Jewish communities against each other and against their regional neighbors simultaneously required a scale of effort that simply wasn't achievable until relatively recently in the history of genetic research. The research that finally addressed this question head-on involved sampling and sequencing DNA from Jewish communities across an enormous geographic range, from Iraqi and Iranian Jewish communities in the Middle East to Georgian and Mountain Jewish communities in the Caucasus to Bukharan Jewish communities in Central Asia, alongside Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities in Europe, and comparing all of them not just against each other, but against the non-Jewish populations who had been their neighbors in each of those specific regions for the same span of centuries. This kind of study represented a significant undertaking, requiring researchers to work with community organizations across multiple continents to responsibly recruit participants whose own family histories could be reasonably documented within the specific community being studied, then genotyping hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across each sample, and running the kind of large-scale statistical clustering analysis that can only reliably detect subtle population-level patterns when enough individuals from enough distinct communities are included. Earlier, smaller-scale genetic studies of individual Jewish communities had produced suggestive but incomplete results over the preceding decades. This larger, more systematically comparative approach, published in a leading scientific journal, was what finally allowed researchers to test the competing theories against each other directly and rigorously, rather than relying on smaller, harder-to-generalize samples. That comparison against neighboring populations is what makes this research design so genuinely clever, and it's worth understanding why. If Eastern Jewish communities really had been fully absorbed into their surrounding populations over 2,000 years, their DNA should look essentially indistinguishable from an Iraqi Muslim, Iranian Muslim, or Georgian Christian neighbor sampled from the same region. If instead those communities had maintained real genetic continuity with each other and with a shared ancient origin, despite the surrounding cultural and linguistic assimilation that clearly had occurred, their DNA should cluster together and separately from their regional neighbors, even after all that time. Here's what the data actually showed, and it settled the debate more clearly than almost anyone studying the question expected going in. Despite living for well over 1,000 years, in several cases over 2,000 years, among distinctly different host populations, speaking different regional languages, and absorbing real elements of the surrounding culture, the various Mizrahi Jewish communities studied, Iraqi, Iranian, Georgian, Bukharan, and several others, showed a consistent pattern of genetic clustering with each other, and with Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish populations sampled from entirely different continents more strongly than any of them clustered with their immediate non-Jewish geographic neighbors. When researchers plotted these populations using standard population genetics clustering techniques, which group individuals together based purely on overall genetic similarity without any reference to labels like religion or nationality, the various Jewish communities from wildly different parts of the world consistently grouped together into a recognizable, coherent cluster, sitting apart from their respective regional neighbors, who instead clustered more closely with other populations from their own broader geographic region. An Iraqi Jewish sample and a Yemenite Jewish sample, despite representing communities separated by huge geographic distance and centuries of largely independent history, sat closer together on this genetic map than either sat to a non-Jewish population sampled from their own immediate home region. That's not a subtle statistical artifact easily explained away. It's a clear, visually and statistically obvious pattern that held up across repeated analysis. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. An Iraqi Jewish person and an Iranian Jewish person, separated by a national border and by centuries of living under different regional empires, dynasties, and cultural influences, turned out to be more genetically similar to each other than either was to a non-Jewish Iraqi or Iranian neighbor, living in the same city, speaking the same language for the same span of centuries. That's a remarkable finding because geography and shared regional environment are usually the single strongest predictor of genetic similarity between any two populations. Communities that share a shared religious and communal identity, rather than shared geography, outweighing that expected geographic pattern this clearly, is a genuinely unusual result in population genetics. The explanation researchers converged on traces back to that same historical detail mentioned earlier. Sustained, communally enforced practices around marrying within the faith, maintained across many generations in each of these distinct regional communities, independently, without the different communities being in regular contact with each other across those centuries. Iraqi Jewish communities weren't coordinating with Bukharan Jewish communities to preserve a shared gene pool on purpose. Each community independently maintained its own internal marriage patterns for religious and social reasons specific to its own local context, and the cumulative genetic effect, replicated independently across several widely separated Mizrahi communities, produced a shared traceable signal linking all of them back toward a common ancestral origin, even though none of them had any way of coordinating that outcome with each other. That common ancestral origin, when researchers traced it further back, consistently pointed toward the ancient Levant, the region encompassing modern Israel, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, and parts of Syria and Jordan, the same region where Jewish history itself places its ancient origin, and the same region the Babylonian exile and the later Roman-era dispersals actually began from, according to the historical record. The genetic data and the traditional historical narrative, which had never been directly testable against each other before, turned out to line up with real, measurable precision. This is also where the research revealed something else worth sitting with, because it adds real nuance rather than a simple, clean story. While the shared ancestral signal was clearly present and clearly traceable across these Eastern Jewish communities, the data also showed real measurable admixture with regional host populations in every single community studied. Nobody's ancestry turned out to be a perfectly preserved, completely unmixed time capsule from 2,600 years ago. Iranian Jewish communities show a detectable genetic contribution from the broader Iranian population around them, reflecting well over 2,000 years of shared regional life, occasional intermarriage, and, at certain historical periods, documented instances of forced or circumstantial conversion that would have introduced local ancestry into the community's gene pool. Georgian and mountain Jewish communities in the Caucasus show a detectable contribution from Caucasus populations consistent with the region's long history of relatively fluid movement and contact between its many distinct ethnic and religious communities living in close proximity across the mountainous terrain. Bukharan Jewish communities show a measurable Central Asian genetic contribution reflecting centuries of life along Silk Road trade routes that connected diverse populations moving through the region on a regular basis. The pattern researchers actually found wasn't zero mixing, total isolation. It was something more precise and, honestly, more historically believable, a real shared ancestral core that survived clearly detectable and traceable, layered underneath a real but comparatively smaller degree of regional admixture that varied somewhat from community to community, depending on the specific historical circumstances, degree of communal insularity, and regional context each one experienced across its own particular history. That nuance matters because it resolves the original debate in a way neither extreme position had quite gotten right. The communities weren't fully absorbed and genetically indistinguishable from their neighbors, the way one competing theory predicted. But they also weren't perfectly isolated and unmixed for over 2,000 years, the way an oversimplified version of the other theory might have implied. The real answer sat in between, a genuine, traceable shared ancestry, real enough and strong enough to override the expected geographic pattern entirely, existing alongside real, measurable local admixture that reflected the actual lived history of each community in its own specific region, rather than either a myth of total purity or an assumption of total dissolution. There's a particularly striking detail that emerged when researchers looked specifically at the Y chromosome data passed down exclusively through the paternal line across these communities. A specific set of paternal lineages associated with the Kohanim, the hereditary Jewish priestly line traditionally understood to descend patrilineally from a single ancient ancestor, showed up at notably elevated frequency across multiple, independently sampled Jewish communities spanning an enormous geographic range, from Ashkenazi communities in Europe to Sephardic communities and several of the Mizrahi communities studied in this research. What makes this particular result so scientifically compelling is the timeline it implies. For a shared paternal lineage to show up at elevated frequency consistently across communities that split apart from each other and stopped having regular contact well over 1,000 years ago, in some cases closer to 2,000 years ago, that lineage has to have already been established and already relatively common within the ancestral population before those communities went their separate geographic ways. It's essentially a genetic paper trail, preserved independently in multiple locked rooms that haven't communicated with each other since the door closed, and each room turns out to contain a strikingly similar signature. Researchers estimated the shared ancestral lineage traces back on the order of roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years, a timeline that lines up remarkably well with the traditional dating of the priestly line's establishment described in Jewish religious texts, an alignment between genetic dating and religious tradition that few researchers expected to see hold up this cleanly when the study began. Finding a shared elevated paternal lineage signal like that replicated independently across communities that had had essentially no direct contact with each other for well over 1,000 years is exactly the kind of evidence that turns a plausible historical tradition into something genetics can actually measure and confirm with real statistical weight. It's worth being precise about what this research does and doesn't claim, because good science stays careful about its own limits, especially on a topic this historically and religiously significant to millions of people today. This research doesn't claim every individual within every one of these communities carries an identical, unbroken genetic line back to ancient Judea. Individual family histories within any community vary, and genetic ancestry research works with population-level patterns and averages, not perfect predictions, about any single person. Some families within any given community will show more admixture than the community average, and some will show less, simply as a matter of ordinary statistical variation across thousands of individual family histories spanning dozens of generations. It also doesn't claim these communities are somehow more authentically connected to the ancient Levant than any other Jewish community that wasn't included in a given study, or that the genetic evidence alone should be read as making some kind of claim about religious legitimacy or identity. Genetics describes biological ancestry, a real and measurable thing, but it was never designed to settle questions of religious or cultural identity, which involve far more than DNA alone, and which different communities and individuals are free to define for themselves independent of what any genetic test reports. There's also an important methodological caveat worth mentioning. Studies like this one work with the specific individuals who volunteered to participate at the specific time the research was conducted, and results can shift somewhat depending on exactly which communities and subcommunities are included, how sample sizes compare across different groups, and which statistical methods are applied to the resulting data. Subsequent research building on these initial findings has continued to refine the picture in various ways, adding additional communities, additional genetic markers, and more sophisticated statistical methods. But the core finding that shared ancestry substantially outweighs regional geography in explaining the genetic relationships between these communities has held up consistently across multiple independent research efforts since the original studies were published, which is exactly the kind of replication that gives a scientific finding real staying power. What the research does credibly establish, with real statistical strength behind it, is that the shared origin story, passed down through religious tradition and oral history across these widely dispersed Eastern Jewish communities, a story that, before genetic sequencing existed, historians had no independent, non-textual way to verify, holds up remarkably well against direct genetic testing. Communities separated by well over 1,000 years, thousands of miles, and dramatically different regional host cultures still carry a measurable, shared genetic signature pointing back toward the same ancient regional origin, a result that would have been considered a fairly bold prediction before anyone actually had the data to test it. There's a broader scientific lesson in this case that extends well beyond any one specific community's history. Genetic ancestry doesn't automatically fade to nothing just because a population lives for a long time among a different surrounding population. What actually determines whether a distinct ancestral signal survives or gradually dissolves into the regional background comes down largely to actual patterns of intermarriage over many generations, not simply how much time has passed or how much surface-level cultural assimilation, language adoption, or shared daily life occurred alongside it. Compare this case to other well-studied diaspora and minority populations around the world, and the pattern generally holds. Populations that maintained strict, sustained boundaries around marriage and communal membership across many generations, whether for religious, cultural, or caste-based reasons, consistently show more preserved, more distinctive genetic signatures today than populations that experienced more open intermarriage with their surroundings, regardless of how much time has passed in either case. Time alone dilutes very little. Sustained social and religious structure, maintained deliberately across generations, is what actually preserves a distinct ancestral signal, or fails to. A community can absorb enormous amounts of its neighbor's language, cuisine, and everyday culture, the way Eastern Jewish communities clearly did across Iraq, Iran, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Iraqi Jews spoke a distinct dialect of Arabic. Iranian Jews spoke Persian. Bukharan Jews developed their own dialect of Tajik, and all of these communities absorbed real elements of their surrounding regional cuisine, dress, and daily custom, while still maintaining a genuinely distinct and traceable genetic thread underneath all of that surface-level cultural blending. simply through sustained patterns of marrying within the community across generations. Culture and biology in a case like this one turn out to be far more separable than intuition might suggest. You can look, sound, and live almost entirely like your neighbors on the surface, while your genome quietly tells a different, older story underneath. That's also why this particular case has become something of a reference point in population genetics more broadly, cited well beyond just Jewish history specifically, whenever researchers study other diaspora populations, religious minorities, or long-separated communities anywhere in the world and ask the same basic question: does shared identity maintained through communal and religious practice rather than shared geography actually leave a measurable genetic trace after many centuries of separation? In this case, the answer turned out to be a clear and well-documented yes. And the strength of that signal, replicated independently across so many separately isolated communities, is part of why this particular result carried so much scientific weight when it was finally published. It's worth noting how this particular debate differs from the more widely publicized argument over Ashkenazi Jewish origins, since the two are often confused with each other. The Ashkenazi question has centered largely on a competing theory proposing descent from the Khazars, a Turkic-speaking kingdom in the region of the Caucasus and southern Russia that converted to Judaism as a ruling elite around the 8th century, a theory that genetic research has, in study after study, found little supporting evidence for, with Ashkenazi populations instead showing a clear shared genetic core with Sephardic and Mizrahi communities, pointing back toward the same Levantine origin. The Eastern Jewish, or Mizrahi, question addressed in the research covered in this video is a related but distinct question, not whether these Middle Eastern and Central Asian communities descend from a completely different, unrelated founding population, but simply how much genetic continuity survived after so many centuries embedded within such different regional host populations. Both debates, run independently through completely different research designs, ultimately pointed toward the same broader conclusion: a real, shared ancestral core connecting Jewish communities across an enormous geographic range, consistently more significant than regional geography alone would predict. Put the whole picture together, and what emerges is a genuinely remarkable case study in how far a shared identity, maintained deliberately across dozens of generations and thousands of miles, can actually be traced in DNA. Iraqi, Iranian, Georgian, and Bukharan Jewish communities, separated from each other by well over 1,000 years of largely independent history, each living for centuries under entirely different regional empires and cultures, still carry a measurable genetic thread connecting them back to each other and toward the same ancient regional origin. Not because anyone coordinated it across those centuries and those thousands of miles, but because each community independently maintained the same basic pattern of practice for long enough that the genetic result ended up essentially identical and traceable when scientists finally had the tools to go looking for it directly. There's also a human dimension to this research worth acknowledging, separate from the statistics themselves. For many participants in these studies, and for the wider communities they represent, having a 2,000-year oral tradition independently confirmed by direct genetic evidence carried real emotional and cultural weight, particularly for communities like the Iraqi and Iranian Jewish communities, whose populations were overwhelmingly displaced from their ancestral homelands within a single generation during the mid-20th century, scattering what had been continuous, rooted communities across new countries in a remarkably short span of time. For descendants of that displacement, research like this offered something written records alone couldn't fully provide: a direct biological confirmation of continuity stretching back far earlier than any surviving family document could reach. There's something worth sitting with in that. For centuries, this question could only be argued from written sources, oral tradition, and inference, real evidence, but evidence that skeptics on either side could always find ways to dismiss or reinterpret to fit whichever theory they already favored. A written chronicle can be lost, altered, or biased by whoever recorded it. An oral tradition can shift subtly across generations of retelling. DNA doesn't have that problem. It sat quietly in millions of cells in community after community across 2,500 years, completely indifferent to whatever anyone believed about it, waiting for the specific moment technology finally became capable of reading it directly and comparing it side by side across every one of these separated communities at once. That's ultimately what solved means in a case like this one. Not that every detail of a 2,000-year story is now perfectly known, because plenty of specific historical detail remains genuinely uncertain and probably always will. It means the core shape of the debate, the basic either-or question that historians had argued over for centuries without a way to test it directly, finally has a real evidence-based answer. The shared identity was real. It left a real measurable trace, and it survived quietly in the DNA of communities scattered across 3 continents long enough for modern science to finally catch up and confirm what oral tradition had been claiming all along. If this changed how you think about diaspora history, or about how much of a shared identity can actually survive measurably across many centuries and thousands of miles of separation, tell me in the comments which part of this surprised you the most. The strength of the shared ancestral signal, the Kohanim lineage result, or the specific pattern of regional admixture layered underneath it. I read every comment, and it's usually where the next deep dive comes from. And if you want more of the real, evidence-based story behind the world's most debated ancestral mysteries, subscribe now. We're just getting started.